By the beginning of the 1920s, cinema was no longer a novelty. It had outgrown its early period of short, novelty-driven programs and begun to occupy a more permanent place in public life. Feature-length films were becoming the dominant form, theaters were expanding in size and ambition, and audiences were learning how to read images with increasing sophistication. At the same time, the medium had not yet settled into a single identity, sound had not arrived. Narrative conventions were still flexible. No global agreement existed about what cinema was supposed to do or how it should behave. That uncertainty defines the decade more than any single movement or technological breakthrough. The 1920s were a period in which cinema experimented freely because it still could. Different countries explored different solutions to the same underlying problem: how to shape time, movement, emotion, and meaning through images alone. Silent films were almost never truly silent. Music accompanied screenings in nearly every context, from small-town theaters to elaborate urban movie palaces. The relationship between image and sound was already active, even if it had not yet been standardized. This gave filmmakers extraordinary freedom. Without synchronized dialogue, performance relied on gesture, framing, rhythm, and duration. Editing carried emotional weight. Camera movement became expressive rather than illustrative. Cinema learned to think visually before it learned how to speak. In the United States, the 1920s marked the consolidation of cinema as a national industry. Hollywood studios expanded their control over production, distribution, and exhibition. Movie palaces became cultural landmarks, drawing audiences from across social classes into shared viewing spaces. Stars emerged as global figures. Genres stabilized. Narrative clarity became a commercial priority. Films like The Kid, Safety Last, The General, and The Big Parade reflect the range of American cinema during this period. Comedy refined physical precision into storytelling. War films balanced spectacle with sentiment. Epics like Ben-Hur demonstrated how scale and spectacle could be sustained across feature-length narratives. These films helped establish Hollywood's narrative grammar as an international reference point. In the same period, African American filmmakers in the United States were building an alternative cinema outside the Hollywood system. Working under segregation and exclusion, directors like Oscar Micheaux produced dozens of independent features that addressed racism, religion, class, and identity directly, often in conscious opposition to mainstream distortions. Films such as Within Our Gates and Body and Soul presented black characters as complex protagonists with interior lives at a time when Hollywood largely refused to do so. These works circulated through segregated theaters, churches, and community venues, forming a parallel exhibition network that existed alongside Hollywood's rise, but remained structurally excluded from it. The consolidation of Hollywood was formalized in 1927 with the founding of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, signaling an industry beginning to regulate itself, define prestige, and fix standards of craft and recognition. Yet even at its most confident, American cinema in the 1920s did not exist in isolation. Many of the decade's most radical developments occurred elsewhere, often responding to social conditions that Hollywood did not share. In Germany, cinema became a site for psychological and moral inquiry shaped by post-war instability. Films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, The Last Laugh, and Metropolis did not aim for photographic realism. They externalized anxiety, authority, and alienation through distorted architecture, exaggerated gesture, and stylized movement. Space itself became expressive. Sets bent, shadows stretched. Meaning lived in the shape of the world on screen. This approach influenced horror, science fiction, and art cinema for decades, but it also represented a specific historical moment. These films emerged from a society grappling with trauma, economic uncertainty, and shifting power structures. Cinema absorbed those pressures and made them visible through form. Elsewhere in Europe, different priorities emerged. Scandinavian cinema pursued moral seriousness and spiritual reflection. The Phantom Carriage treats death, guilt, and redemption with restraint, using supernatural imagery as a means of ethical inquiry. In France, Impressionist filmmakers explored interior experience through rhythm and duration, seen clearly in films like The Smiling Madame Boudet. The Passion of Joan of Arc, produced within this broader European art cinema environment, pursued emotional intensity through faces and proximity rather than plot. European cinema in the 1920s was also shaped by movement, not just of styles, but of people. As Hollywood consolidated power, some filmmakers and performers found their opportunities narrowing rather than expanding. One of the clearest examples is Anna May Wong, who left the United States mid-decade after being repeatedly denied substantive roles. In Europe, she found work that treated her as a serious screen presence, including Pavement Butterfly, where her performance is carried through gesture, framing, and atmosphere instead of stereotype. Her trajectory complicates the idea that artistic freedom flowed only toward Hollywood. Opportunity moved unevenly across borders, shaped by race, politics, and industrial control. Cinema in the 1920s was global not because it was unified, but because artists were constantly negotiating where they could work and what kinds of images they were allowed to make. In some places, that negotiation became explicit. Nowhere was the relationship between cinema, labor, and structure more openly debated than in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, cinema developed under intense ideological and institutional debate. Filmmakers argued openly about what film should be responsible for and how it should function socially. This produced some of the most influential works of the decade. Battleship Potemkin demonstrated how editing could organize emotion and political meaning through rhythm and collision. Man with a Movie Camera went further, stripping cinema down to its processes. It presented labor, movement, repetition, and observation without narrative anchors. These films treated editing as a form of thought, using structure, rhythm, and collision to organize reality. What distinguishes Soviet cinema of the 1920s is not simply montage technique, but the belief that film could actively reshape perception. Cinema was not entertainment alone, it was a tool for organizing experience. At the same time, nonfiction cinema was developing outside the Soviet Union as well, with films like Nanook of the North demonstrating that feature-length cinema could be built around observation and lived experience, even as its methods and ethics differed sharply from Vertov's approach. Japanese cinema developed along a different path, shaped by distinct exhibition practices and performance traditions. Silent films were often accompanied by a benshi, a live narrator who stood beside the screen and voiced dialogue, described action, and guided audience response during the screening. Film in this context existed as a hybrid experience, combining projected images with live performance. This complicates the idea of silent cinema and challenges Western assumptions about film form. A Page of Madness stands as a crucial example of Japanese experimentation during the decade. Long thought lost, its rediscovery revealed a cinema engaged with psychological fragmentation, subjective perception, and avant-garde form independent of European movements. Its existence suggests that Japanese filmmakers were already exploring radical possibilities, even though much of that work would later be lost or forgotten. The 1920s were not confined to Europe, Japan, and Hollywood. Film production existed across Latin America, South Asia, China, and Africa, often under conditions that made preservation difficult. India produced mythological epics and social dramas at remarkable volume. Mexican cinema laid groundwork for the golden age that followed. Chinese urban cinema responded to modernization and class change. These films survive unevenly, not because they lacked importance, but because infrastructure and access determined what entered historical memory. Queer presence also existed throughout the decade, often embedded in performance rather than declared in plot. Weimar cinema allowed gender ambiguity and same-sex desire to appear openly before political suppression erased that visibility. Films like Pandora's Box carry queer texture through character, gesture, and gaze. Stardom itself became a site of ambiguity, with performers like Louise Brooks and Asta Nielsen cultivating identities that resisted fixed gender norms. Women played essential creative roles throughout the silent era, particularly in editing, writing, animation, and directing. Figures such as Germaine Dulac and Lotte Reiniger contributed work during the 1920s, even as those contributions were later sidelined as the industry continued to change. Dulac's work ranged from intimate psychological studies like The Smiling Madame Boudet to overt formal experimentation in The Seashell and The Clergyman, often cited as cinema's first surrealist film. Reiniger's The Adventures of Prince Ahmed remains a landmark in animation, completed decades before feature-length animation became an industrial form. Animation in the 1920s was not a novelty sideline, but a developing cinematic language of its own, capable of sustaining complex narrative, rhythm, and visual authorship alongside live-action film. By the end of the decade, this openness, across geography, identity, and form, was about to be reshaped by technological change that would alter how films were made, performed, and experienced.
And in the end, sent me a friend.
The decade ended with a technological shift that changed everything. The jazz singer demonstrated that synchronized dialogue could draw audiences in unprecedented numbers, even as its use of blackface ties that breakthrough to a legacy of racial caricature and exclusion embedded in early sound cinema. Within a few years, sound reshaped production, performance, and exhibition worldwide. Careers ended, styles vanished. The silent grammar that had taken decades to refine disappeared almost overnight. The same transition reshaped animation as Mickey Mouse debuted in Steamboat Willie, introducing synchronized sound to animated performance and marking the early emergence of Walt Disney as a figure who would later dominate global animation. The sound transition reshaped how films were made and experienced. Sound altered rhythm, performance, and pacing, introducing new constraints alongside new expressive possibilities.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Looking back, the 1920s appear less like a single movement and more like a field of parallel experiments. Cinema had not yet decided what it was allowed to be. Different cultures offered different answers. Some focused on psychology, others on labor, others on spectacle, spirituality, or community. Many of these films were lost. Others survived by chance. Some had to be rediscovered decades later. What remains is a record of a medium thinking out loud, testing itself across geography and circumstance. For Cinematic Century Chronicle, this decade matters because it reveals cinema before it stabilized, before rules hardened, before sound closed one set of doors and opened another.